At 02:17 hours on 11 July 1944, Staff Sergeant William H. Mercer is standing barefoot on cold concrete, the soles of his feet numbing as moisture creeps up from the floor. The warehouse squats on the outskirts of St. Lo, a brick and timber shell commandeered by the Germans after the rail spur was bombed out 3 weeks earlier. The air inside is heavy and damp, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, Atlantic cold that never quite leaves Normandy, even in July. A single bulb hangs from a frayed wire, flickering irregularly, throwing shadows that jump and stretch across stacked crates stamped with black stencils. Mercer keeps his eyes half-lidded. He breathes through his nose. Diesel fumes linger from a truck that idled too long in the yard. Tobacco smoke curls low, sharp and sour. Somewhere deeper in the building, a man laughs, short, careless. Outside, artillery answers artillery. American 155s firing counter-battery, the dull concussion arriving 8 seconds after the distant flash. The concrete beneath Mercer's feet vibrates faintly, like a heartbeat. Against the far wall, leaning at a careless angle, rests his weapon. The Germans had laughed when they saw it. One of them, tall, narrow-faced, a corporal by the chevrons, had nudged it with the toe of his boot. Spielzeug, he'd said. A toy. The gun looked wrong to them, too squat, too crude, weld scars like stitches along the receiver, the barrel chopped short, ending blunt and unfinished. It smelled of machine grease and burned oil, not the clean, blued steel they respected. They had taken Mercer's boots, his helmet, his field jacket. They had not bothered to take the gun far. There are 21 guards assigned to the warehouse tonight. Mercer has counted them by sound and shadow. 14 inside, spread loose, men sitting on crates, rifles stacked against walls, an MP-40 slung carelessly over a chair back. 7 outside, smoking near the trucks, boots crunching on gravel. There is an MG-34 in the corner by the loading bay door, belt draped over the receiver like an afterthought. No one is manning it. Mercer's wrists ache where the rope bit earlier. The skin is raw. His knuckles are split. He rolls his shoulders once, slowly, feeling the stiffness there. Beneath the wool shirt, sweat has cooled and turned clammy. His fingers remember the weight of the gun even as his eyes refuse to look at it directly. A guard passes behind him, boots loud on concrete. Another sets his Car 98K against a wall with a hollow clack, the sound echoing longer than it should. Someone tears cigarette paper. Someone else coughs. The bulb flickers, steadies, flickers again. 02:17:10. Mercer shifts his weight a fraction, testing the floor. The cold has crept up past his arches. He welcomes it. It keeps him present. He exhales, slow, measured. The smell of old blood, iron and rot, seeps from the cracks in the concrete, layered beneath diesel and smoke. He had smelled it before, in a hedgerow 3 days earlier, when a boy from Ohio stopped breathing with his mouth open, surprised. 02:17:14. A guard at the card table laughs again, slaps the crate for emphasis. Another turns his back, distracted by a noise outside. The room settles into a dangerous rhythm, the kind born of fatigue and familiarity, men who believe the night is theirs. Mercer lets his chin drop. His right hand opens, closes once. The skin of his palm is slick with grease where he wiped it earlier, a habit from years on a factory floor. He takes one step, not forward, not back, just enough to shorten the distance by 3 feet. The weapon is still there, untouched, waiting. 02:17:18. He reaches. Metal meets skin. The grip is warm where it had rested near the engine earlier, the grease tacky under his fingers. The weight settles into his hand, 6 pounds, familiar as a hammer. His thumb finds the safety by feel. There is a soft, unmistakable click as it disengages, swallowed by the distant boom of artillery. A guard turns his head, just a little, eyes narrowing, curiosity not yet sharpened into alarm. Mercer brings up the gun, elbows tucked, stands compact. He does not rush, he does not hesitate. The world contracts to angles and distances, to the line from his shoulder through the barrel's blunt end. The bulb flickers once more. William H. Mercer was born in 1916 in a narrow row house on East 8th Avenue in Homestead, Pennsylvania, less than half a mile from the Monongahela River. The mill dominated everything. It set the hours, colored the sky, and coated every surface with a fine gray dust that crept into lungs and settled there. On some nights, the open hearth furnaces burned so bright the clouds glowed orange, like a false dawn that never quite arrived. His father worked the furnaces, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, leather aprons stiff with sweat and slag. His hands were scarred and thickened, fingers bent slightly inward even at rest. He did not talk much at home. When he did, it was practical. If something broke, you fixed it. If you couldn't fix it, you replaced it. Complaints were a luxury for men who didn't need their hands to eat. Mercer learned early to stay out of the way and pay attention. He watched how things fit together, how heat changed metal, how noise became a constant, something you stopped noticing because you had to. By 14, he could strip and reassemble a busted kitchen clock faster than most men could find the problem. By 16, he was running errands for machinists who trusted him not to lose parts. The Depression narrowed choices. School ended early. Work began immediately. In 1934, at 18, Mercer hired on at Homestead Steelworks as a riveter and punch press operator. The job was loud, dirty, and exacting. 12-hour shifts were common. The press cycled relentlessly. Down, up, rotate. 18 to 22 rivets a minute if you wanted to keep pace. Miss a beat and you lost skin. Miss 2 and you lost fingers. The tolerances were unforgiving. Fractions of an inch mattered. The work trained his hands to move without hesitation, his eyes to judge distance and alignment instinctively. He learned how machines failed and how to coax them back to life with improvised fixes when supervisors weren't looking. Filed edges, adjusted springs, welds that weren't in the manual but held anyway. The noise never stopped. Steel screamed, presses slammed, overhead cranes groaned on their loads measured in tons. Mercer learned to think inside it, to narrow his focus until only the task remained. Men around him shouted to be heard. Mercer spoke only when necessary. He did not hurry, but he was fast. He did not argue, but he did things his way. Supervisors noticed. They wrote him up more than once for unauthorized adjustments. They also kept him on the line during layoffs. Results mattered more than method, even if no one said it out loud. By 1941, he had spent 7 years on that floor. His grip strength was exceptional, his timing precise. He was comfortable around danger, not reckless, just familiar with it. He had learned to work when mistakes carried consequences. On the morning of 7 December 1941, Mercer was in the boarding house kitchen nursing black coffee before the early shift. The radio crackled with static before the announcer found his voice. Pearl Harbor, battleships burning, aircraft with red circles on their wings. There was no shouting in the room, just the scrape of chairs as men stood up. Someone swore quietly. Mercer listened, finished his coffee, and rinsed the cup. By the time he stepped outside into the cold, the decision had already settled. He enlisted in January 1942. He chose infantry, not because it made sense, but because it was direct. He did not want to fix machines while other men fought. He did not explain this to anyone. Basic training was a shock of a different kind. The noise was familiar, the structure was not. Drill instructors emphasized manuals, procedures, doctrine. Everything had a correct way, written down somewhere. Mercer followed orders, but he asked questions about equipment failures, about issued weapons jamming under mud or sand. The answers were rarely satisfactory. He qualified well on the range. His fire was controlled, deliberate. Instructors noted his calm under pressure and his tendency to adjust stances and grips without being told. Difficult but competent, one evaluation read. Assigned to a rifle squad, Mercer quickly earned a reputation. The other enlisted men called him Mill or Rivet. He did not correct them. He shared cigarettes. He shared food. He said little. When things went wrong during exercises, it was the one men looked to, not for speeches but for solutions. He reloaded faster than most. He conserved ammunition instinctively. He did not fire unless he meant to hit something. Officers noticed his effectiveness and his disregard for strict adherence to training diagrams. They warned him. He nodded and continued working the way he knew. When the unit received M3 submachine guns, Mercer was one of the few who didn't complain. The weapon was crude, stamped metal, heavy trigger pull. Others dismissed it as unreliable. Mercer took one apart, cleaned it, and put it back together with small adjustments that improved the feel. He did not ask permission. By the time the division shipped out, his kit bore subtle signs of modification: filed edges, adjusted straps, reinforced seams. Nothing obvious enough to draw formal attention. Enough to matter when things went bad. They left the United States later that year, packed tight aboard a transport that smelled of oil, sweat, and sickness. The Atlantic was rough. Men vomited over rails. Mercer spent hours below deck, cleaning weapons, listening to the creep of steel under strain. He slept when he could, standing if necessary. England was rain and mud and waiting. Endless drills, endless inspections. Mercer continued to work quietly, refining his equipment. The grease gun changed shape under his hands, shorter, more compact, tuned to his grip and timing. When they finally crossed the channel and landed in Normandy, the world narrowed again. Hedges replaced steel, mud replaced slag. The principles were the same. Things broke. Men died. Mercer fixed what he could and endured the rest. By July 1944, the war had stripped away any remaining illusions. Doctrine lagged behind reality. Survival favored those who adapted. Mercer was ready to do exactly that. By the second week of July 1944, the American infantryman in Normandy was fighting a war no manual had prepared him for. The doctrine assumed space, open fields, clear lines of sight, engagement distances measured in hundreds of yards. Normandy offered none of that. The hedgerows collapsed distance to nothing. Stone barns, wine cellars, dairy sheds, and half-bombed warehouses turned combat into something intimate and immediate. Engagements began at 20 feet, often less. Staff Sergeant William H. Mercer noticed it immediately. Standard-issue rifles were 43 inches long. In narrow doorways and stairwells, that length became a liability. Men had to cant their weapons sideways, exposing elbows and ribs. Bolts had to be cycled manually, metal on metal, each motion costing time measured in fractions of a second that no longer existed. Rear area doctrine was worse. Warehouses, supply depots, and rail buildings were treated as low threat once bypassed. Security was lax on both sides. The Germans grew careless, so did the Americans. Mercer saw it not as cowardice or poor training, but as mismatch. Tools designed for one kind of war forced into another. And the cost was measured in names. Private First Class Thomas Riley was 19 years old. He was from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he had worked briefly in a shoe factory before the Army. On 6 July 1944, his squad was ordered to clear a dairy shed near a sunken lane. The shed was 15 feet wide, low-ceilinged, with a single wooden door reinforced by iron straps. Riley entered second. The man ahead of him hesitated, rifle catching briefly at the doorframe. The delay was less than a second. A German soldier inside fired once. Distance, 8 feet. The bullet struck Riley high in the chest. He was dead before he hit the dirt floor. Mercer arrived moments later. He noted the angle of the shot, the position of the body, the way the rifle lay across Riley's arm, bolt half open. 2 days later, it was Corporal James Red Hollis, 27, from Des Moines, Iowa. Hollis was a veteran by Normandy standards. Calm, reliable. He died in a stairwell inside a stone farmhouse. The stairwell turned sharply to the left after 6 steps. Hollis followed procedure, paused, shouldered his rifle, leaned out just enough to check the angle. The German at the top fired downward with an MP-40. Distance, 10 feet. The round struck Hollis in the neck and shoulder. He fell backward down the steps, rifle clattering. He lived for less than a minute. Then there was Private Samuel Ortiz, 22, from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ortiz's M1 carbine jammed during a room entry, mud in the action. He tried to clear it the way he'd been taught. The German did not give him time. Mercer watched Ortiz die from across the room, pinned by his own position, unable to move without exposing another man. Each death followed the rules. Each death made sense on paper. None of them made sense on the ground. The moment that hardened Mercer came on 9 July in the cellar of a bombed-out manor house. The room was low, the ceiling barely 6.5 feet. Stone walls sweated moisture. The air smelled of mold and cordite. A single bulb cast weak yellow light. Mercer was third in the stack. The lead man hesitated. Procedure dictated spacing, 3 feet too far. A German soldier stepped out from behind the support column and fired. Mercer heard the shot before he saw the result. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The smell of burned powder filled the room instantly. The man in front of Mercer went down without a sound. Mercer's rifle came up, but the moment was gone. The German had already withdrawn deeper into the cellar. The rules cost them a man. Mercer knelt beside the body long enough to confirm there was nothing to be done. He noted the distance again. Always the distance. That night, he did not sleep. Mercer raised the issue the next morning, first with the platoon lieutenant, a young man, capable, exhausted. Mercer spoke plainly: shorter weapons, faster entries, adjustments to spacing and procedure. He did not raise his voice. The lieutenant listened, nodded, and said, "That's not authorized. We can't just change doctrine in the field." Later, Mercer spoke to the company weapons officer. He demonstrated how the M3 could be modified for close quarters, explained the benefits, reduced length, controlled bursts. The officer frowned. If higher wants changes, they'll issue them. Put it in a report. Mercer knew what that meant. Paper moved slower than bullets. By that evening, Mercer had made his decision. He would not wait. He would not argue further. He understood the consequences. Unauthorized modifications were grounds for punishment, possibly worse. He stripped his M3 again under low light, filed, adjusted, tested the action by hand, listening to the sound, feeling for resistance. He worked with the same care he had on the steel line years earlier. He did not speak about it. He did not seek permission. He accepted the cost. When the time came, he would act. And if he survived, he would answer for it later.
Mercer worked at night. The barn sat half-collapsed on the edge of an apple orchard, its roof punched through by shrapnel weeks earlier. One wall leaned outward at a shallow angle, supported by nothing more than habit and gravity. The smell inside was old hay, damp wood, and rot. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, artillery rumbled intermittently, distant enough to be ignored. He laid his gear out on an upturned crate with the same care he once used on a steel workbench. The M3 submachine gun was not elegant. It was stamped steel and rough welds, designed for speed of manufacture, not admiration. Mercer stripped it down piece by piece, laying the parts in order. He worked by touch more than sight, a hooded flashlight angled low so the beam wouldn't carry. First, the barrel. He measured twice with a ruler scavenged from a destroyed farmhouse desk. 6.2 inches. Short enough to move in tight spaces, long enough to keep the .45 ACP stable. He wrapped the barrel in cloth to muffle the sound and cut slowly, the file biting into steel with a muted rasp. Each stroke was deliberate, no wasted motion. Next, the foregrip. He had salvaged the aluminum days earlier from a downed aircraft wing, light, strong, already shaped by another kind of war. He cut it to fit his hand, then welded it beneath the receiver using a small torch and borrowed fuel. The welds weren't pretty, but they held. He tested them with pressure, then more pressure, until his knuckles whitened. Finally, the bolt. This was the most delicate work. The M3's cyclic rate, about 450 rounds per minute, was manageable, but Mercer wanted control. He filed a shallow notch, just enough to allow him to interrupt the cycle with pressure alone. It wasn't something a manual would ever endorse. It was something his hands understood. When he reassembled the weapon, it felt different, shorter, tighter, balanced closer to the body. He weighed it in his hands, lighter by several ounces, faster. Not perfect, nothing ever was, but fit for the war he was actually fighting. Testing came next. Mercer waited until after midnight when the sky clouded over and the mist rolled in from the low ground. Visibility dropped to less than 40 yards. He walked out to an earthen berm at the edge of the orchard and paced off distances with slow, measured steps. 5 feet, 10, 15. He loaded a single magazine, 30 rounds. He did not waste ammunition. The first burst was short, 2 rounds. The recoil came straight back into his shoulder, solid but controllable. The muzzle rose slightly, then settled. Brass ejected downward, clinking softly against damp earth. He adjusted his grip, changed his stance by inches. The second burst was 3 rounds, tighter, better. He fired again at 10 feet, then 15. Each time he watched how the weapon behaved, how the shortened barrel changed the sound, deeper, sharper, how the flash bloomed briefly then vanished, how the smell of burned oil and powder hung low in the mist. By the end of the magazine, his shoulder was warm, his hands were steady. The timing was there. He did not smile. He packed up, erased his footprints where he could, and returned to the lines before dawn. The mission briefing was short and dismissive. A warehouse complex near St. Lo, marked low priority, possibly abandoned. The kind of place that fell between lines on a map and stayed there until someone stumbled into trouble. Mercer was assigned to night reconnaissance with 2 others. The odds were not discussed out loud, but he knew them. If compromised, escape probability dropped below 5%. Capture was worse. The weather worked against them. Overcast sky, light mist. Sound carried unpredictably. By 0140 hours, Mercer was alone. The other 2 had pulled back after spotting movement near the access road. Mercer continued forward, low and slow, drawn by something he couldn't name. Routine, perhaps, or instinct. He reached the warehouse perimeter at 0205. He was inside 12 minutes later. At 0217 hours, the room was settled into its careless rhythm. Mercer moved. The first man was 6 feet away. He fired 2 rounds center mass. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. The guard dropped without a word. The second turned, mouth open. He fired again, 3 rounds. Distance 8 feet. The man spun and fell against a crate, sliding down. Shouts erupted. Confusion, not coordination. Mercer pivoted left, weapon tucked close. Another guard fumbled for his rifle. He fired once, twice. The man collapsed forward, weapon clattering. He moved constantly. 3 steps, pivot, fire. The shortened barrel cleared corners effortlessly. The foregrip anchored the weapon. His burst stayed short, controlled. No wasted rounds. At 0217:20, 4 men were down. A guard near the card table tried to run. Mercer fired at 12 feet, 3 rounds striking high. The man pitched forward, skidding on concrete. Someone screamed. Someone else fired wildly, rounds cracking overhead. Mercer dropped to one knee, rolled behind a stack of crates, and came up firing. The recoil was familiar, predictable. At 0217:30, the MG-34 was still unmanned. 2 guards near the loading bay hesitated, looking toward the sound rather than acting. Mercer closed the distance to 10 feet and fired in sequence. 2 rounds, pause, 2 rounds. Both men fell. Smoke hung low now. The bulb flickered violently, then steadied. Mercer felt the heat in his arms, the burn in his shoulder. His earring narrowed to a dull roar. He reloaded without looking, magazine slamming home by muscle memory alone. A guard appeared at the doorway, silhouetted. He fired immediately, distance 15 feet. The man dropped backward, out of sight. At 0217:45, the last guard inside fell near the wall, weapon unfired. Silence followed, sudden, absolute. Mercer stood still, weapon raised, breathing controlled. Smoke drifted slowly toward the rafters. Spent brass littered the floor. He counted bodies the way he'd counted rivets once, clinically. 21. His ears rang. His hands trembled slightly now that the work was done. He did not linger. He stepped over the threshold and disappeared into the mist, moving away from the warehouse just as the night swallowed the sound of his footsteps. By the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to explain.
The warehouse was discovered at first light. An American patrol moved in cautiously, rifles up, boots crunching over gravel still damp with mist. They expected resistance. What they found instead was silence and bodies. German soldiers lay where they had fallen, sprawled near crates, slumped against walls, collapsed in doorways. No signs of a prolonged fight, no blast damage, no structural collapse, just men, dead where they stood. Someone counted twice to be sure. 21. The lieutenant on scene frowned, walked the floor again, tried to reconstruct something that made sense. There were no friendly casualties, no shell craters, no evidence of a firefight that matched the result. The reports didn't line up with the reality. Word spread the way it always did, not through channels, not through paper. Men talked quietly while cleaning weapons. Someone said it had been one man. Someone else said that couldn't be right. No one raised their voice. Mercer was questioned briefly that afternoon. He answered directly. Times, distances, no adjectives, no heroics. When asked how many Germans there were, he gave the number without emphasis. When asked how he got out, he said, "I walked." The questioning ended there. Within weeks, something changed. It wasn't written down. No orders came down from battalion. No new manuals appeared. But in Mercer's company, casualty reports began to look different. Room-clearing deaths dropped by nearly 20%. Stairwells stopped claiming men at the same rate. Engagements inside buildings ended faster, sometimes in seconds instead of minutes. Men began adjusting spacing instinctively. Weapons came up quicker. Stocks were shortened by an inch here, a strap cut there. No one credited a single incident. No one needed to. The war moved on. Saint-Lô fell. The hedgerows gave way to open ground, but the lessons stayed with the men who survived long enough to carry them forward. Battalion command knew. They had to. Reports filtered upward. Numbers shifted. Patterns emerged. Someone asked questions that didn't get written down. Someone else decided not to press. Weapon modifications were still unauthorized. Mercer's grease gun did not appear on any inventory list in its altered form. No citation was submitted. No recommendation drafted. A captain spoke to Mercer once, alone, after an evening briefing. His tone was neutral. "Don't make a habit of it," he said. Mercer nodded. That was the end of it. He kept using the weapon. Others kept copying what they could. No one asked for permission again. The Germans adapted too. Rear area security tightened. Guards doubled up. MGs were manned instead of left idle. Doors were barred. Lights stayed on longer. The easy carelessness vanished. It didn't last. Allied pressure was relentless. Supplies ran short. Units rotated too quickly for lessons to stick. The war no longer gave the enemy time to adjust fully. By the fall of 1944, the warehouses no longer mattered. The front had moved on. Mercer survived the war. He did not come home early. He stayed with his unit through the push into Germany, through the exhaustion and the noise and the attrition that ground men down without ceremony. When the end finally came, it did so without fanfare. He was discharged in 1945. He returned to Homestead, Pennsylvania, to the same river, the same mills. The furnaces still burned. The sky still glowed at night. He took a job on a punch press, the rhythm as familiar as breathing. He rented a small place. He kept his head down. He did not join veterans organizations. He did not attend parades. He kept no trophies. His uniform went into a box and stayed there. When asked about the war, he said only that it was loud. Years later, manuals changed. Close quarters battle became a subject instead of an afterthought. Weapons grew shorter. Room-clearing drills emphasized speed and violence of action. Spacing tightened. The lessons were formalized, sanitized, given names and diagrams. Mercer's name did not appear anywhere. It didn't need to. His contribution was absorbed the way working men's solutions often are, quietly, anonymously, passed hand to hand until no one remembers where they came from. The doctrine caught up eventually. It always does. but only after someone pays the price to prove it wrong. At 02:17 hours on 11 July 1944, in a warehouse outside St. Lo, a steel worker from Pennsylvania solved a problem the Army hadn't yet admitted it had. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it to change doctrine. He did it because men were dying, and the tools weren't good enough. History remembers generals and plans. It forgets men like Mercer, men who adapt, who fix what's broken, and who accept the cost without complaint.